Sometimes it takes some really messed up things for a good thing to happen. All of those warning signs at various locations you see that seem just really weird, most likely something bad happened that warranted that warning sign. It'll be a bit before we get to that. We've got to get through the bad stuff first. February 28, 1917. Ruth Cruger disappeared February 13, 1917 in New York City. Unfortunately, she would be grouped together with all of the other girls in New York City that had gone missing, some 1,000 in just 3 years, who were never found. Ruth was last seen alive February 13th. She had gone to a motorcycle shop on 126th Street, close to her home, to get her ice skates sharpened, and she was never seen again. The owner of that shop, Alfredo Cochi, was questioned by detectives in an attempt to trace Ruth's movements. But by the next day, he too had disappeared. If your oh crap meter is going off, then you're better than the New York City detectives at this point. Because though initially they thought there was a connection between these two disappearances, they weren't able to substantiate that. They tried to figure out if there was any sort of relationship between the two beyond shopkeeper and customer, and no. They searched the shop, even tearing out walls, but nothing of a suspicious nature was found, and it was surmised that Alfredo had nothing to do with Ruth's disappearance, and that he had simply disappeared himself to not get mixed up in the case. Is your meter still going off? Ruth was a high school graduate, aged 17 or 18, and a Sunday school teacher, with a seemingly good home life. She had not shown any changes in attitude of late, was not having any sort of relationship with a guy. Her friends and acquaintances were questioned, and no one could explain why she would just up and leave. When she was first reported missing, the police, as typical even nowadays sometimes, believed she had left home on her own volition and was fine and alive, so they did nothing for 24 hours per their custom. But the more time that passes, the more unlikely that seems. Now, back in these times, they have the term white slavers, which basically is like the term we use now of human trafficking. That theory is being thrown around as a possibility. And now it's nearly a month since she disappeared, and her whereabouts are still unknown. Hundreds of detectives have combed New York City for a clue. Not surprisingly, Ruth's father, Henry Cruger, blames the police for their failure to solve this mystery after a month. Understandable. Police and Assistant DA John Dooling think that Ruth is alive and purposely staying away. You'll see who was right. So, the backstory. Prior to the disappearance, Ruth's parents went to Boston, Mr. Cruger on a business trip and his wife accompanying him. 3 of their daughters were at home: Helen, who worked, Christine, who was at home and sick, and Ruth, the youngest, and again, about 18 years old, who loved a good skate at the lake at Van Cortlandt Park. On the day of her disappearance, Ruth went out and cashed a check for $25. She paid some bills and came back home, showing her sister the bills she had paid, totaling $3, and giving her the remaining $22 from the check. After lunch, Ruth told her sister she was going to go back and pick up her skates from a shop she had left them at to be sharpened. She left the house in old clothes, not dressing up for this venture, and taking 25 cents to pay for the sharpening. That was the last she had been seen or heard from. Christine, again the sister at home sick, called Helen, the oldest, at work when Ruth had not come home after 2 hours. Helen hurried home from work, got the story from Christine, and headed to the motorcycle shop owned and run by Alfredo. He told Helen that a girl who resembled her description of Ruth did come in, picked up her skates, and left, walking in the opposite direction of her home. That evening, Helen contacted a family friend about the situation, and they both decided that the parents, still in Boston, needed to get home. The Crugers arrived back home that night, and the next day, Ruth was officially reported missing. Alfredo, of course, as already mentioned, was questioned by the police, who again found nothing suspicious, and the police turned their attention elsewhere. The following day, Alfredo's wife would go to the detectives and ask them for help finding her husband, Alfredo. He had borrowed $5 from her and left. The detectives did a search, found nothing. Mr. Cruger, Ruth's father, is putting his eggs in the Alfredo basket. Quote, "Find Coachy and you will find my daughter," end quote. He has put up a $500 reward for the return of Alfredo. That's how much he believes that Ruth is dead, and it's because of Alfredo. Police are like, nah, regarding Alfredo with Ruth. They're just looking for Alfredo as a missing person and not as a suspect. These are two separate incidences, don't you know? And so starts some suspicious activity of the police. Yes, indeed. Some believe that the police are the ones that told Alfredo to go hide himself. Oh, really? It's crickets for a few more months, and boy doggy, were the police about to get their comeuppance. June 16th, 1917. Ruth's body was found. You know Alfredo's shop that was so thoroughly searched? Yeah, there, in the cellar, below a concrete floor. Men hired by the counsel for the family, one Mrs. Grace Humiston, yes, lady lawyer, who is our rock star here, were digging it up. 15 minutes before her body was found, detectives from their 4th Branch Bureau were laughing at the dig. It would be found that Ruth died from a blow to her skull, just above her right ear. Her legs and arms were bound, and she had been jammed head first into the hole in the cellar floor. Clothing was found on top of her body, and on top of that was a 1/4 ton of scrap iron. Dirt on top of that was smoothed out level-ish, and the flooring had been replaced. Now, what was said was that she could have been found earlier. Alfredo's wife, after the alleged desertion of her husband, who is still missing, was trying to sell the business and would not allow anyone to destroy any part of the business because of that. Of course, the police were very understanding and wouldn't push the issue, and so would not approve the digging up of the cellar. The moment the sale of the business building was complete, one of the men who had bought the place turned the keys over to Mrs. Humiston, and work on the dig began. The buyers of the business were Edward Lind and Charles Greenbaum. Lind turned the keys over to Grace, and Detective Sergeant McGee would supervise the work at the behest of Police Commissioner Woods. The diggers were Peter McEntee and John Spittle. The diggers were working on the street side of the cellar, while an inspection of the other side, the until now always locked machine shop side, would commence. Peter Solon, superintendent of the Grand Central Terminal where Mr. Cruger had his offices, was helping with the search, looking at the machine shop area. Solon would take note of an odd arrangement: a workman's bench fastened to a wall, and near it 2 tool chests. One of the chests was pushed out from the wall, and neither chest was sitting level on the floor. Solon would call over Grace and Jules Crone, the Cruger family private detective, to look at what he found. With the help of the 2 diggers, they removed the tool chest and saw that the chest had been covering up a 2 to 3 foot hole in the floor. The boards on the floor had been sawed away and replaced, but something beneath them was preventing the floor from laying flat. Below the boards, concrete flooring had been broken up, exposing dirt beneath it. Below the dirt was scrap iron, broken tools, motorcycle parts, making for difficult digging. And then clothing. 2 pairs of khaki motorcycle trousers, pair of leggings, a sheet of rubber about 1.5 feet square, a pair of knee pads, a gray plaid coat and vest, black trousers, 2 caps, pair of tennis shoes, and a heavy tan leather shoe. Unfortunately, now would be the time when the odor of a decaying body would hit the diggers. Carefully removing dirt from around her, Detective Sergeant McGee would enlarge the hole to carefully lift her body out. Dr. Robert Letty, doctor at the Knickerbocker Hospital, was on the scene by the time her body was removed. He would find that her arms had been tied to her body about the waist. Rope tied her legs together below the knees. Her body had been shoved into the hole so hard that her knees were against her chest. By all appearances, she had fought hard. The blue coat, white shirt, and black skirt she wore were ripped and torn. Her hands still wore gloves. When one of the gloves was removed, they found a gold ring with the initials of her high school, from which she had graduated the previous year. She also was still wearing her customary watch, stopped at 2:10 p.m. Ruth was believed to have entered the shop at approximately 1:00 p.m. At the finding of her body, Ruth's father, Henry Cruger, was notified, and he came to the shop. He refused when asked if he would identify her, but when he saw her school ring, he fell apart. The morbid and the curious came out in droves, even chasing down the wagon carrying her body, but reserve policemen held them in check. Police Commissioner Woods would say about Grace Humiston, the family lawyer, quote, "To Mrs. Humiston is due the entire credit for finding the body," end quote. When plainly asked why the police hadn't bothered to dig up the cellar 4 months earlier, he would say, quote, "I cannot understand that myself," end quote. He would further state that an investigation into why the police were so lax on this case would be forthcoming. Apparently, when the 4th Branch Detective Bureau had been urged to make a thorough investigation of the cellar the day after Ruth had disappeared, the Bureau said, "Nah, there was no use since dust on boxes and benches showed they hadn't been disturbed in some time." Geez, people. Prior to her finding the body, Grace would say, quote, "The police department is trying to discourage me in this search, but we will go on with the excavation just the same. I mean to carry this thing through," end quote. Again, prior to the excavation, Captain Cooper, when ordered by Police Commissioner Woods to help Grace, would state, quote, "We have absolutely nothing to do with this. This is Mrs. Humiston's investigation and we know nothing about it," end quote. Yeah, your lack of support, not a good look. Grace would also ask if the police would be willing to pay for the laborers doing the digging since searching for the body was a public matter. Captain Cooper would say that she was doing the public service. Grace would pay for the labor herself. One of the diggers, Peter McEntee, was the one who came upon a clue leading to the body discovery. On the night of Ruth's disappearance, he saw Alfredo come out of the cellar after midnight with his trousers stained by what looked like dirt. Following the statement and other investigations by Crone, private detective, would lead them to attempt the extensive search of the cellar. Off to the police are Mrs. Cochee and her 2 kids, accompanied by her lawyer. Her lawyer would say that the wife didn't believe Alfredo would kill, but that if he had done it, she wanted him punished. Why wouldn't she let them dig? Well, she was trying to sell the place and was concerned a cellar excavation would prevent a purchase. Quickly, we're questioning witnesses, including the diggers who did the excavation, the owner's wife, and one of her friends, the janitor of the building next door, and a one-time partner of Alfredo, plus several other former employees. Assistant DA Mancuso had a warrant issued for the arrest of Alfredo for first-degree murder, signed off by Magistrate Murphy in the Night Court, not the 80s TV show, and it was taken to Governor Whitman for signature. The governor will forward it to the State Department because, well, now things are a little messy. Alfredo has been found in Bologna, Italy. So let's talk about extradition, shall we? And Private Detective Crone is concerned and feels that more of the cellar needs to be dug up. They also found a corset cover and another women's style shirt. Crone would say, quote, "We are going to continue to dig until we are certain that there is nothing else there, if we have to tear up the whole cellar to do it," end quote. So let's talk about some more bad detective issues. Apparently for 2 years under Police Commissioner Woods, the Detective Bureau has been the main failure. It's been pointed out by police over and over, noting that inexperienced men were being assigned as detectives to big cases. There were shifts in commissioners, other personnel in higher places, but things were still falling through the cracks. And let's talk about lawyer Grace Humiston. Grace took charge of the case of missing Ruth Cruger on April 1st. Ruth's father, hearing about Grace's involvement in another case, would seek out her help. Grace would state, quote, "I'll get that girl, dead or alive, and I'll get into that cellar first. The place where the girl was last seen is a place to begin to hunt for her," end quote. But she would not take the credit after finding Ruth's body. She would state, quote, "I only want to place the greatest emphasis on the good character Ruth Cruger bore until the day she disappeared. Many a girl who disappears is alleged to have gone to the bad willingly, and, as in similar cases, many have said the same thing regarding Ruth. I have had this opinion drummed into my head until I nearly went crazy. I decided to follow all clues suggested by neighbors who hinted at the presence of bad characters in the case, but in each investigation found nothing but praiseworthy conduct on the part of this unfortunate girl. When I first took up this case, I decided to work on 3 theories. The first was that the girl had left home of her own volition. The second, that she had been abducted. The third, that she was dead." End quote. Grace went to school in New York, graduated from the New York Law School in 1904. 2 years later, she got the death sentence of a woman commuted down to 7.5 years. 2 more sentences she had commuted down through her efforts, making her the one who saved 3 lives from the electric chair. She continued to practice among the poor and friendless who were suffering injustice. She is, at this time, a member of the Mutual Welfare League at Sing Sing Prison and president of the People's Campaign League, an organization that fights capital punishment. June 17th. Ruth underwent an autopsy conducted by Dr. Otto Schultz, who I believe is an old friend of the channel, accompanied by Drs. Benjamin Schwartz and L.L. Danforth. They believe in all probability she was assaulted and that she was killed while trying to prevent it. There was a deep fracture to the right side of her head, and on the left side of her abdomen, a stab wound. Further excavation did unearth her eye skates, which had bloodstains and threads of her hair, possibly signifying that her own skates were used as a weapon against her. And the stab wound was made by a heavy knife that went almost through to her spine. June 18th. Evening World newspaper is coming down hard on police and detectives, calling Alfredo the murderer a friend of bicycle policemen. Alfredo is apparently under arrest in Italy, but more about all of that later. District Attorney Swan is conducting a little query into police conduct of the case. Mayor Mitchell said that the failure of police to find Ruth's body in the cellar was inexcusable. Some feel that the alleged interference into the case was courtesy of certain bike detectives who hung around the shop. Detective Bureau insisted they did everything possible, but don't talk about why they didn't move the tool chest, why they only focused on the theory that Ruth went away with some guy when there was nothing to back up that story. It was also said that when the investigation switched to trying to find Alfredo, it was because they believed if they found Alfredo, they would find Ruth. Here are the facts that the DA is looking into from Evening World newspaper, June 18, 1917. First, Ruth took her pair of skates to Cochie's shop for sharpening the morning of February 13th. Second, she left her home about 2 blocks from Cochie's place in the early afternoon to get the skates. There was no mystery about her movements in this respect. Third, Cochie closed his shop at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Fourth, when Ruth Cruger had not returned to her home at 7 o'clock in the evening, her sister, after telegraphing to her parents, who were in Boston, went to the West 125th Street police station and reported the case. Fifth, the lieutenant on duty following a police custom made a memorandum of the case to wait 24 hours for investigation. Sixth, in consequence, the police search of Ruth Cruger was not begun until the next day, whereas a visit to Cochie's shop that night would undoubtedly have revealed the crime, for the murdered was burying the body while the police department loafed. Seventh, when Cochie was questioned by detectives, he admitted that Ruth Cruger, or a girl answering her description, had been in his shop between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the day before. He said she took her skates away, and the last he saw of her, she was walking towards Manhattan Street. Eighth, Cochie's statement, backed, it is believed, by police friendship, was accepted and only a perfunctory search of his place was made. Ninth, from police sources came a story that Ruth Cruger had been seen in the company of a man passing from a taxicab to a subway station in Harlem. 10th, after Cochie disappeared, no thorough search of his place was made by the police. The sleuth theory was that the girl had gone away with Cochie. 11th, concealment of the body was clumsy, as was evidenced by the fact that when skilled investigators outside the police department went into his place, they found Ruth Cruger's corpse, and Cochie, perhaps with the aid of others, hid the victim of the crime while the detectives were held back by official red tape and the police habit of forming conclusions and trying to make the conclusions good. 12th, and Cochie was about the place for 2 days, but was permitted to escape, although a most material witness, even were he guiltless of the crime. Grace is also asking for the further investigation into 22 missing girls who she believes could have met a similar fate as Ruth. And everyone wants Alfredo back in the U.S., including his wife. She would say, quote, "I was amazed to learn of the discovery of the body of the missing girl in the cellar of my husband's shop. If he killed her, he was not alone in the crime. He is too much of a coward to do anything like that by himself. I hope they bring him back here, and if he is guilty, I want to see him punished." End quote. To her credit, she is the one that alerted authorities in the U.S. to his whereabouts in Bologna, Italy, and that it was her attorney, not her, who told them not to let anyone dig up the cellar. But I'm still not sure how I feel about her yet. Another question. How did Cochi get himself to Italy? What kind of friends does he have that would pay for that kind of money when he allegedly wouldn't have had it for himself? He supposedly left with just his working clothes on and $10, according to his wife. He arrived in Bologna, according to the American consul, well-dressed and with plenty of money. Grace Humiston, after some of her own investigation into Alfredo, would say he was one of a group of men who sought out young women for what I'm assuming is something akin to human trafficking. He used to have a similar business on another street some time ago, and he was charged with indecency and immorality of a girl, but nothing much was said about those charges. Grace would make further comment about the police botching the investigation and what they thought about Ruth. Quote, "Ruth was not a willful girl who left her home voluntarily, as every police official connected with the search assured me that she was. They had no proof. None of them had a single fact against her, but they all said that she could not possibly have been abducted. They pitied me for my faith in girl nature, but I have proved that she didn't leave home that way. I have proved that she was a brave, good girl and that she died in an effort to shield her honor. It was not the old story that the police harp on when a girl disappears and detectives fail to trace her. It was a murder, one of the most hideous in the history of the city, one that will mark New York with an indelible stain of dishonor if it does not lead to better protection for our girls and a more determined administration of the criminal law against the degenerate men who are preying upon them." End quote. With her energy now devoted to causes like that of Ruth, she has decided to give up her law practice and instead work against human trafficking. If the police are willing to support their work, the Bureau would become a branch of the police department. If not, the Bureau would need to be independent. Early July 1917 begins with a grand jury inquiry. Not really regarding whether or not Alfredo killed her, but the governor wants to know if the inability to find Ruth's body and the subsequent escape of Alfredo was due to any willful negligence from anyone in the police department. July 9, 1917. Over in Bologna, Judge Zucconi has begun receiving information from New York regarding the finding of Ruth and the state of her body. He interrogated Alfredo in his prison cell, confronting him with this new information, including how Ruth's body was bound. Though Alfredo would start crying, he would insist he had not actually hit Ruth, but that she had hurt herself falling while trying to escape. Back to the police inquiry. Chief Police Inspector Schmidberger filed charges of improper conduct against a few police lieutenants and a couple of detective sergeants. Charges of perjury are also being considered. One lieutenant is charged with negligence in that he failed to ascertain that Ruth Cruger's disappearance had not been entered in the records of the Bureau, and another is charged with having entered the report of the disappearance as of 9:43 a.m. on February 14th, when he knew it had been received at midnight on February 13th. The two detectives are charged with not properly searching Alfredo's shop after being told to do so. October 1917. Alfredo, still an Italian citizen, would not be returned to the U.S. for trial. Italy would refuse to extradite him because Alfredo was still Italian, and they have a statute that forbids the extradition of an Italian citizen charged with crimes committed in other countries. Now, if you're worried that Alfredo will just get away with it, no. Alfredo would go on trial in Italy for the murder of Ruth. Now, this takes a bit of time. We're in the summer of 1919. First, Alfredo confessed his guilt, very graphically, and then he turned on a dime, took back his confession, and blamed his wife. So now his trial is at a standstill while the court reviews the case of Alfredo's wife. She had gone before the grand jury in New York and they declared her not guilty. So now Alfredo is saying, quote, "My wife killed the girl. She thought every woman who entered my store was unduly interested in me. She saw Miss Cruger go into my place of business. Miss Cruger was at the moment bending over a desk, writing her address that I might send to her home the skate she was to leave to be sharpened. My wife seized a hammer and struck the young girl 3 terrific blows on the head. When I saw the young woman was dead, I helped my wife hide the body." End quote. He said that he had lied to shield his wife, but now he wanted to tell the truth. Not much stock is being taken in this, although his lawyer has pounced on this, as you can imagine. So why would Alfredo run and not his wife? Anywho, the Italian jury wasn't buying it. One juror would say, quote, "He gained nothing by his dramatic presentation in the court of the affair. The very description of the incidents was enough to accuse him, disregarding any of the motives that he might have had. His tale was certainly well prepared for him. Of course, it is certainly his plan to have his trial postponed again and again, so that he will be entitled to receive his friends and his meals in prison, instead of suffering solitary confinement." End quote. Speaking of delays, there is another one. Now, I don't know what on earth happened, but somehow the trial got extended all the way into October 1920. We're back on trial in Italy again. Alfredo is saying that he didn't do it, taking back his confessions. But we have a man who had a cell next to him, one Aldo de Rossi. "I do love me in prison snitches. Quote, Coachy told me he had assaulted the girl and then killed her, but he did not give many particulars." End quote. And on the presentation of other depositions taken where Alfredo confessed, even his own counsel would say, quote, "Certainly he killed her, but he had had 5 glasses of California wine." End quote. Signor Franchini, the prosecution equivalent, asked for murder in the first degree, attempted criminal assaults, falsifying passports, falsifying enrollment in the military service with the max penalty of all charges. Regarding the defense's too much wine excuse, quote, "California wine may be strong, but no wine in the world, whether from California or elsewhere, is strong enough to drive a man to commit such a dastardly deed." End quote. So what happened? He was found guilty, sentenced to 27 years of prison. What was the good that came of Ruth's murder? It was the formation of the Bureau of Missing Persons in March 1917, formed actually before Ruth was found. But I think at that point, when she was declared disappeared, people were just not having it anymore. Another missing person. In this case, another young woman, and nothing being done and nothing being found. Now, the Bureau in its infancy would still not find Ruth. That was the work of grace. But between the months of March 1917 and January 1st, 1918, it handled 636 cases. Within 10 years, the number of men at the Bureau was doubled, and in 1927, they had handled some 10,000 cases. By 1943, 32,000 cases, 99.2% solved. But of those, only about 12,000 were actually missing people. Many cases were missing the identity, which are even harder to solve. So they reordered some of the Bureau a bit to allow for people to investigate missing identities, those who have died but are not identified when they show up at the morgue and are not claimed. Frustrating to bring you another story of another girl or young woman murdered or missing. And I'm not sure what draws me to these stories, but the desire to have their stories told. Lives ending way too soon for stupid reasons, if a reason is even given. This is odd to say at this point, but please enjoy your holidays, whatever you celebrate. See you in the new year.